Hi, everyone. So I'm back with Kathy Bonchek, one of my good friends. She taught me everything that I know about public speaking, which maybe don't use that against her. But what she did do is teach me a lot about thinking about communication. So earlier we spoke about how to communicate to different communication styles and what that means for the way you present your company, your ideas, or yourself for that matter. And Kathy, with this session, I'd like to talk a little bit more about that aspect. So first off, let's talk a little bit about those communication styles again, just for anybody that missed the executive summary earlier.
Yes. So the communication styles, they're actually known as the social styles, are four ways in which people communicate with the world. And the whole gist of this, Mike, is that people give their information in the way they hope to receive it. So everybody you're talking to is constantly giving you clues about their preferred communication or social style. And the reason that's important is that the whole idea of communication is not to package your words, your pitch, your information in perfection. It's that it lands. It's that the message lands and is understood. So the thing about being an effective communicator is about recognizing what people are giving you as clues so that you can take information and make sure I always say to my clients, it's as if you have a platter and you're putting something delicious and delectable on it to suit the taste of the person that you're serving. Same thing with our information and our messages.
That's an excellent point. Sorry, that's an excellent point, Anthony, because very often I am communicating in the way that I think the message should be understood, when in reality, I need to think more about communicating in the way that will be understood. And so understanding who I'm talking to. So for example, what is my style? We already know the answer. Tell me anyway.
I would say you're over in that expressive corner, but with a really heavy dose of driver.
Right.
And the reason I know that about you, Mike, is the sheer energy with which you communicate, the number of words that you use, sort of that little bounce that you have as a communicator. But you do have a fair amount. You're on that side of the quadrant, as I would call it, because both the driver and the expressive are the tellers. So like, just tell me what to do. Let's get it done. Let's not waste time. And so you have a very keen sense of the direction that you're leading in. And you'll take a lot of words to get there, but there's a part of you that's a little impatient.
So I should be more brief in my discussions.
Oh, let me just say sometimes, yes.
Very well, that's fine. But you are right in terms of when I listen to somebody, I want them to tell me what it is we're doing now. Like, what are your action points? What are your elements? But I also want a little bit of that story of the shining city on the hill kind of aspect, that there has to be some poetic nature to like the story you're telling me. I want a narrative. That's what I tell all my pitch companies very heavily is, what's your narrative? What is the story you're trying to tell?
Absolutely. But you also appreciate the beauty of language, which is part of your expressive self too. And so, but not everyone does. There are some people who the language is numbers and process and have you done research and show me evidence. I would call that the analytical social style, who really doesn't want to be hurried. And in fact, you should not start a meeting with an analytical and say, this is what we're going to do. You should be saying, let me show you what we've done, how we've proven our case, and I will build to the conclusion and the ask in a way that they're comfortable. And you have to slow down even the pace of which you speak to them. And you have to make sure that they're with you and have lots of time for questioning. And when they question, they are not in any way second guessing you. They are just seeking to understand and to really understand the process behind it. And so if you have an expressive with an analytical, you have a diagonal, what I call a diagonal clash, because the expressive is like, it's beautiful, just trust me and go for it. And the analytical is like, wait a minute, I don't trust that. I need a little bit more data. The driver, who is that really bottom line, let's get it done, the person you want to follow into battle, the great general, is diagonally opposed to what I call the amiable social style, because the amiable social style is the softer, gentler, people related. Let's make sure we have consensus. Let's make sure that all contingencies have been thought of. Let's really make sure that we're all, taking everybody into consideration.
Or as I like to say, the people that make a 1 hour meeting take 3 hours. That group.
Well, that's a little unfair, Mike, but there's some truth to it in that it does take longer. I would say the analyticals and the amiable social styles require more time. They have a gentler asking approach to the world, where they come in and say, do you have a minute? What are your thoughts about this? Where the expressive and the drivers are busy telling people what to do. Mm-hmm. And so it's not necessarily 3 hours, but I would leave time. And I always say with amiable decision makers, don't rush to your conclusion there either. You have to do it after the rapport has been met. They have to know that they can trust you and work with you.
Help me out a little bit, because very often what happens is we get 5 minutes into a meeting and I'm expected to now pivot based on that communication style. What are the early signals that I can be looking for so that I know that, my telling personality, as you put it, is starting to grate and then I need to back the hell off?
I love that you asked this, because the whole thing about communication is, I say, 9/10 observation. You're from the minute you walk into the Zoom room or the real room, you are letting there be some space between what you're saying, and you're watching the reactions. And so you may know somebody, you may know me, and I'm an expressive with a very high level of amiable. And so I knew that the world often sees me as amiable because of the way that I pivot toward people. But even I have my driver moments. And so you knowing me as I am, usually, if I'm like, yep, that's great. Yeah, we have a deadline, and start giving you driver signals, you just pivot to where I am. We're already doing this. Most of us are pretty effective in communicating in the world, and we've been doing this just because it's good practice and we know how to do it. But when you start to do it mindfully, it's magical.
I think it's a very important element, though, that those of us that are drivers or tellers, as it will, we will be, in my experience, at least this is speaking for myself, I am much more likely to pick up on those co-driver or co-teller signals than I am on picking up on the other side of the quadrants, right?
Yes.
It's like, so what training can I do for myself? Like, what can I do when I go into that meeting to pull me back from being me and start looking for those alternating signals that I don't always look for?
You do something before you even get into the meeting, is that you have already done your research in terms of what I call audience analysis. You've called everybody you know before you walk into that room or you have that meeting, and you say things like, does Kathy like stories, or does she like facts? Do I use a visual aid for Kathy, or do I give her a deck that's 50 pages long? What's your experience been? Does she like to argue with you? Does she want to test your belief in what you're saying by having a little bit of a fight with you? Or does she just agree, or want harmony in the meeting? People know these things. The other thing I always like to say is call people's voicemails if you can still access them. The voicemail, the outgoing message, is such an indicator of their preferred communication style. The driver message is something like, you know what to do.
Right.
The amiable is, I'm so sorry I missed you. So you get a hint of their warmth, their need for connection, how much they want to drive to the point, just by listening to how they give outgoing messages.
I think this is a very excellent tip to point out to people, is that so often when we ask, I'm meeting John ABC tomorrow, can you tell me a little bit about him? We end up getting their bio, right?
Yes.
They worked here, they went to this school, they did this, he's an expert in this, he did some amazing work here. Him because he's been working with Amanda, GAEH, whatever it may be. And when in reality, we should be talking more about, well, how does he like to run his meetings? Is he like in there 15 minutes, and if you run a minute over, he's done with you? Mm-hmm. Or is he someone that will extend the cycle continuously because he wants to hear the full story?
Absolutely. And then, Mike, the continuation of that is that it doesn't stop. We get into the meeting. This is why every meeting should start with a great question, which is—
wow, what a great point. What a great point to make. Give us an example of any example of a great question.
Well, the great question is, Mike, I called you before this meeting and I had an agenda. What's changed since we last spoke? Has anything become a higher priority for you?
So if you're having a continuing meeting, let's really just talk about the dynamics of our relationship, so that what has changed. How about I'm meeting an investor for the first time, as most of our pitch companies would be. First time they're meeting a VC. What's a good leading question, do you think?
My first question is always about the person I'm speaking to. And so I would say, what is it that you think has led to the success you've had to date?
What marks a good company that you've invested in? Or what could it even be as simple as, what kind of companies are you guys looking for? Or is that too on point?
It could be. I think you might get a more generic answer in that. And so I'd want to get back to that individual in the room.
Personalize.
You're going to talk more about those companies. I want to know what he values, what he knows is the secret ingredient. What does he look for first? And then I always like to ask in priority order. Mm-hmm. So, it when you see a great company to invest in. Give me the top 3 things you look for in priority order.
I like your first point, especially good, is that if you personalize the question, you're going to get a much more qualitatively defined answer, something that's a lot more personal in an answer. Whereas if you talk about just, what do you look for in a company, you're talking about what other things are. If you say instead, what do you attribute your success in choosing companies to? you'll get a much more personal response on that question.
And I think, Mike, because the thing that I know to be true is that what I'm really after in every meeting is the values. I really want to understand the values of the people I'm working with and how it impacts their business decisions. Because it becomes a way that you influence them in terms of their decision making, because you speak to the things they care about first.
Got it.
And sometimes if you have a value mismatch, you may never do business with someone if your values are too divergent and too far apart. And to me, that's the heart of really why you're taking all this effort to communicate in a style that resonates. And I wanted to jump back. I wanted to circle back because
Sure.
as we talk about all this nimbleness, there's one really important thing that my clients ask me all the time, which is, like, am I supposed to be so changeable that people won't recognize me? If I'm jumping from style to style, are people going to think I'm ridiculous or being too much of a chameleon? And I always say, no, the whole idea is that you have to brand yourself, but through that lens of who you are, meet them in that corner of where they are. So I have a driver side. My driver is always going to have the Kathy influence and will always be me, but it's me with shorter sentences, a little bit more direct eye contact, perhaps my chest voice to get my moxie on, versus my softer, gentler, amiable voice. It's still Kathy, and you'd still recognize me in any of those quadrants.
Let's talk a little bit about what we need to do. Like, we've talked about it a lot, about how to meet them halfway, how to do that. But you used a word already called influence, right? And very often when we say we're influencing someone, it almost has an ugly connotation, but that's not true, right?
Not at all.
Right.
Influence is a way to help people see something and that it's in relative value is how I think of influence. And if you have ever studied Cialdini and all of his work on influence, you know that there's many, many ways to get people to do. And we do this by nature. It's a lot of it just happens in terms of there's the, doing what the Jones do versus the Smith versus Jones, of doing what the world thinks is acceptable. I mean, influence has a place in keeping society pretty good as well and strong. But as far as business, we are trying always to influence people to our viewpoint, to do business with us, to make money. And so having influence is not a bad thing or a negative thing, but it's sort of like having rapport. I think of those two as very closely aligned. I'm always seeking rapport because when I have good rapport with whoever I'm working with, then I'm dealing with more honesty. Because you can ask a brilliantly crafted question and you don't have rapport with somebody, you're not going to get an honest answer or any answer. You have rapport, you're going to get more depth to the information that's on the table.
Yeah, I've run into this myself. As you mentioned, I use a lot of words, but not only do I use a lot of words, I fire hose them. So I'm just continuously like, I have so much here that I need to tell you about that I just can't hold myself back. And I definitely get times when I'm running into an amiable or a highly quantitative, where a quantitative will think that I'm full of BS. I'm just a salesman at that point because I haven't done the numbers. Little do they know, I probably have done more numbers than they have. But the way I'm selling it doesn't come across that way. But I'm used to selling to a driver or to the expressives. And so I get enough engagement. I need to go back. We all need to go back and reanalyze how that happened. Right?
And think about it in terms of, if you want to give generics or generalizations is probably the better word. When I think of the driver, this is why we decided to make executive summaries. Executive summary is that memo that goes on top of the deck that says, don't read the deck, here's the bottom line. And
Right.
you trust me enough, just take my word for it and do it. And even that has gotten somewhat bastardized in recent, I see it becoming a very long one-page agenda.
It's not an executive summary anymore, right?
Exactly. It's not at all, but that's what it's really meant for. And
Yeah.
for the expressive, I always think of color and visual, and let's create some excitement and impact and energy. For the amiable, I always speak to the people aspects, and I leave time for that discussion. And for the analytical, this is the one that I come with the charts and the numbers and lots of evidence of what the research has been before this decision.
So you mentioned there the amiable. That's the one I was wondering. Like, and while we're having this conversation, I'm thinking, how would I change my pitch deck? How would I craft a deck in order to speak to each of these individuals? So when we are talking in person, we can pivot. Oh, my audience is more analytical. Let me talk more about that. My audience is more expressive. Let me move to the narrative, to the big story. But when we create a pitch book, it kind of has to be absorbed by all individuals. So the driver, you're right. I find it amusing when I see more and more executive summaries that require an executive summary. It's like you need an abstract of my executive summary. Like that
Exactly.
is missing the point, folks.
Exactly.
So for the driver, we have a very good result. And then kind of the rest of that research report with all of the numbers and graphs and all of the data supporting it. All right, that's obviously speaking to the quantitative folks. Now you say for the expressive, what do we need in there?
You need it to be visually interesting and appealing. I have a lot to say about pitch
I'm
books
sorry,
in
did you just
general.
say that expressives need more pictures than words? Like they just flip through looking at the pictures?
I didn't say they just do picture books, but I do think that they like it to be exciting and they want to see some energy. You might need shorter titles, and we all need fewer words in our pitch books, period. That you need 50% white space for the eye to actually take anything in. We are really, I don't know whoever decided to make PowerPoint the medium of how we communicate, because we've really just not gotten it right yet, I don't think, in most cases.
What
But
a
I would
great
say,
topic for a later event. Like, folks, put the pin in that one, because I'm definitely bringing Kathy back at some point to do pitch book design and why you've been doing it wrong all this time. But yeah,
thank you.
please go
I've
ahead.
been trying to change the world for a long time, Mike. I really appreciate that. But I'm thinking about the quality of what you put in for an expressive. It could be a dynamic visual. It could be a chart with motion. When I think of amiable, and again, I'm using generalizations, I think of a picture of the team that you're working with, or the team that was affected, or testimonials of other people who had had great experiences here will be more meaningful to see. So how you influence and the kind of evidence you give to have someone believe your point would be to the style as well. And you don't have to do it. I mean, I think most of our pitch books have a little bit for everybody, but we tend toward the analytical in what I see in terms of thousands of words on a page and appendixes and et cetera.
Yeah, I would say that if anybody has come to our pitch club meetings, we go for the high science, but it's definitely much more expressive and driver oriented than it is analytical, because we try to get away from this concept of repitching your last white paper that you saw at a conference.
Yes.
We want the data there to show that there is something underneath the hood if you go looking.
Yes.
But we try to definitely stay more expressive.
And I don't want to imply that analytical communicators do not like story. You know, and the other thing we have to be very mindful of is that people don't stay in their boxes. We all have all four of these styles. It's just the amount that we manifest them. But we all have the ability to be in all of these quadrants. We tend to have one that dominates. And so I don't want to say for every analytical, it's only numbers. People get always engaged. And I think the thing that's missing from most of our pitches is true emotion. We forget that people, the storytellers of old, the way that we made our own history was oral. It was through story and was through the emotional impact that people gave. And then in business, we seem to try to beat that out of and when you're talking about healthcare and people's lives, sometimes I hear these pitches and I'm like, are we not mindful that people are going to be saved, their lives are going to be saved by this? Because we get so excited by our science sometimes. We've got to come back to the pure emotion of like, this is wonderful.
I would like to talk more about how to get enough impact behind your presentation such that people remember you.